Hey, good morning. This is your early warning morning briefing for Monday, the 3rd of February, 2025. I'm your host, Mark Nielsen. I'm joined by Jared, Robert, and Mike Shelby today. Jumping inside the Beltway, Robert, I'm going to pull you up for a couple of these. To kick things off, it looks like the SEC is now telling staff that they have to get approved for conducting probes. Robert, can you tell us a little bit more about this and why it matters?
Good morning, Mark. Yeah, so the Securities and Exchange Commission officials are apparently told staff over the weekend that they need to ask SEC leadership for permission before they begin any informal investigations. And according to people who were briefed on these instructions, they said the SEC staff can still begin informal investigations without permission from leaders. And I think this is in addition to what we covered last week with Trump bringing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau under direct control of either the Treasury or the Office of Management and Budget. I think this is another attempt by the Trump administration to rein in some of these financial regulators that were engaging in this deep banking effort against what are called politically exposed persons.
All right, moving on. Robert, also, it looks like we had an advisor, a former advisor to the Federal Reserve, who was just recently indicted for conspiracy to commit economic espionage. This is John Rogers. As I understand it, he was also kind of moonlighting as a professor at a Chinese university. What's going on there?
So Rogers was indicted for conspiracy to commit economic espionage. And according to this indictment, he provided sensitive Federal Reserve economic data to China. And this actually started in May 2013 and ended last Thursday, right before he was in federal court. And according to the indictment, he attempted to steal or stole sensitive trade secrets and was paid $450,000 as a part-time professor by a Chinese university in 2023. This is not something similar to what we talked about before with the Department of Defense and Ariane Tabatabai, who was tied to the Iran experts group. I think there's likely other incidents of this happening. That they're going to. I think the Trump administration is probably going to find more of these. Officials or former officials who have been providing information to China, because this part of China's espionage strategy is this elite capture strategy.
All right. And then finally, it looks like Trump will be slapping on some tariffs, a 25% blanket tariff, which will go on Mexico and Canada, which will go into effect tomorrow. And so we're less than 24 hours before that's supposed to be enacted. There's been a lot of talk about this. Markets are getting a little jittery as well. What's going on there, Robert?
So this is an executive order that imposed this 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico, and also a 10% tariff on Chinese goods and a 10% tariff on Canadian energy imports. What I think is important about this executive order is actually it also ends de minimis tariff exemptions for packages. And that's the tariff exemption where packages lower than $800 in value could be shipped directly into the United States without very much or any scrutiny from customs. I think right now the impact from these on these tariffs on these imports is going to be higher costs on goods that are reliant on overseas supply chains. This includes things like pharmaceuticals, active pharmaceutical ingredients that we've covered extensively, automotive parts, steel, aluminum, and copper. And this 10% tariff on Canadian oil imports is also likely going to cause some energy price and supply disruption, because these Midwest oil refiners, where a lot of this Canadian sour crude goes to, are going to start shifting to U.S. crude sources, depending on how this 10% tariff shakes out. But I do think that this revocation of de minimis duty exemptions is a very important part of this executive order, and it's intended, I think, to curtail fentanyl and fentanyl precursors that are shipped directly into the U.S. And looking at this EO, and part of it is, focused on what Canada can do to basically end this tariff. And a lot of it is focused on this fentanyl production. They even call out in the executive order that, Canadian authorities have actually found many cartel fentanyl labs in Canada. So I think this is where the Trump administration is focused, at least in the Canadian and Mexican tariffs, is focused on this fentanyl crisis.
Yeah. And Robert, just to, there's a lot of talk about how this will affect the American consumer, how it will affect our neighbors. I think it is important to note that we will see some immediate impact of this, ranging from like automakers, for example, are going to be significantly impacted by this. How this will shake out for the average consumer, however, has yet to be seen. But there are, we do expect that there will be an effect if this is not changed, or if their deal is not made, that there will be effect on things like prices, inflation, and so on. It might take a little bit of time, though, for it to get worked out. But I do think it's important to note, I brought this up in the report, which anybody can find later on down the list. But the dollar right now is surging as a result of this tariff announcement, and at the same time, it's depressing a lot of the other values of the other currencies out there right now: the euro, the Chinese yuan, and then also the Canadian dollar and the Mexican peso are now at multi-year lows. This is something that is coinciding is directly impacted by these tariffs, and there's a lot of speculation out there that Canada, Mexico may be facing a recession, as 80% of Mexico's GDP, 70% of Canada's GDP depends on this North American trade. And all that to say, we do not know exactly what's going to happen, how this will get worked out, but this will become a major political issue for Donald Trump and his administration. And as we talk about things like leverage and working out deals, I mean, this is why this particular issue has kind of everybody up in arms and talking. So this is going to be really interesting to watch as it goes forward. The one thing I'll add just with those currencies is, obviously there will be an impact on prices, and that's often been in the media. The media has talked about this a lot, but something to add to that is that as you're seeing these currencies, some surge in value like the dollar, others depress significantly. This also has an impact on the consumer. And so, sometimes it can be a mixed bag as well. And so we'll see how that goes. And I appreciate your insight on there, Robert. Well, let's move on now to our warning items for the day. All right, Robert, I'll keep you on here. So it looks like we've been watching as DOGE and the Trump administration has been setting its sights on USAID. Could you tell us a little bit more about this effort?
Yeah, yesterday, Elon Musk said the Department of Government Efficiency is in the process of shutting down the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, and actually folding the agency into the State Department. And apparently there was a big shakeup where security staff were put on administrative leave after they tried to block the Department of Government Efficiency access to classified systems. And then last week, there were actually more than 50 senior career USAID officials put on administrative leave, and also USAID website and social media accounts were taken down. I think there's two things going on here. One, the Trump administration, I think, is more narrowly focusing on a lot of this, Democratic Party and far left funding infrastructure through USAID. His former State Department official, Mike Benz, who's a big cyber guy that I read a lot of his stuff. He pointed out that USAID is actually was funding an overseas censorship organization that targeted President Trump and conservative social media activity. And they also provided $27 million in grants to the Tides Foundation, which is something we covered, I think, last year, is one of those organizations that money is moved through this U.S. nonprofit network to far left advocacy and protest organizations. But the second thing, I think, is that the Trump administration rolling the remaining USAID functions into the State Department is also likely an attempt to get more direct control over USAID's soft power functions.
Yeah, and I just want to add a little bit of perspective here. For those who do not know much about USAID, this is something that was enacted by JFK back in the early 60s. This was to ostensibly spread American influence in a Cold War context to other parts of the world, and to be able to help develop some of these other countries. And it really, like, the main strategy behind it was to keep these countries from falling to communism. So USAID has been around since the early 60s. It's, ostensibly supposed to spread American influence. And so this idea of soft power, as Robert says, this is one of those things that's been, should be ideally a prong in our, in our attempt to influence and strategically pull other countries into our orbit. But Mike, I want to hear your take on this. How do you look at this?
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting. I just saw some reaction on social media, and a lot of folks on the left are playing the headline game where Elon Musk is trying to gain access to all this information, which is true. And they also said that he was trying to get access to classified information at USAID. And my first question is, well, if this is just purely a civilian agency doing spreading money towards humanitarian causes around the world, why in the world is there classified information there at any rate? And Mark, I think you nailed it. It really is an action arm for intelligence and influence operations.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Mike. There have been many allegations over the years that USAID is used for clandestine purposes. And I do think it's significant that Robert brings up that what Trump's really doing, he's not trying to burn the whole thing to the ground. He's trying to roll it up under the auspices of the State Department, likely putting it under direct control of the Secretary of State. But if you look at this from a perspective of just the bureaucrats involved, the people involved, and some of the funding, having additional oversight might be something that they don't really like. The other side of it is if USAID does fulfill kind of a clandestine purpose at times, this also changes the nature of that mission. And so it puts it under direct control, a lot more oversight. And that is also something that maybe inside of the annals of government, this is something that's not really appreciated by the boots on the ground. So yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think I got missed in a lot of this, but yeah, as we've been discussing this, I also think there's been a lot of like bad information out there. A lot of people on both sides of this, but really people who are criticizing these efforts in trying to say that they're just scrapping all USAID, and that's really not the case. We're really seeing a major reshuffling of government agencies. This is something that has been done many times before. Richard Nixon was one of the first to really push this hard in consolidating lots of these different organizations and putting them under more control of the president. And so I think that we're seeing that here, but this will continue to be a major political football as we get moving forward.
Hey,
all right.
Just one more thing here. Even USAID says it's only about 10% of their funding reaches the intended recipients. Okay, so 10% of all the money they throw at a country or at starvation or women's education in whatever country actually reaches where it's intended. That means 90% is going to someone else. And Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, had a really good take on this. And this just puts it into context, because we've heard, how many starving children are going to die, and it's all these aid patients in Africa are going to die because they don't have American money and all this stuff. Okay, 10% is actually maybe reaching them. But Nayib Bukele said one reason why some of these countries don't actually like all this USAID money is because it gets funneled towards political causes. And I think that's the real problem here, is that so much of this has been used, so much U.S. taxpayer money has been used for efforts other than aid under the auspices of humanitarian work. It is deceitful to say the least.
Yeah, the last thing I'll add, I think that's a great point, Mike. The last thing I'll add is there are many countries have different political actors, sometimes opposition parties, that are very resistant to USAID. And one of the reasons is because it always comes with strings attached. So when you have those strings attached, that it gives the United States a lot of leverage. I think this is the whole concept of soft power, but it can be something that I think what's often assumed is that this aid is always generating lots of public goodwill in these countries. And that's just not always the case. All right.
As Ron Paul said, yeah, this is money going from poor people in a rich country to rich people in a poor country.
It's a great line. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Mike. I appreciate that perspective. Let's move on now down to our next warning item. So it looks like there are a number of red states that are now backing Donald Trump's deportation efforts and trying to adapt to this and helping the administration do this. Robert, what's going on? Which states are involved and how are they doing this?
Well, so in addition to what we covered last week with Florida's immigration efforts, now Tennessee, Nebraska, Indiana, and Texas are backing the Trump's federal deportation efforts. Tennessee's General Assembly passed a Senate bill that actually created a centralized immigration enforcement office and a grant program that would help fund local and state law enforcement to enforce federal immigration laws. We're also seeing some executive orders in Indiana and Nebraska that are directing state governments to cooperate with the Trump administration. And Texas is also, Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick said that Texas legislature is going to prioritize a bill requiring local law enforcement to assist with deportations. And Governor Greg Abbott actually just announced this morning that he has also empowered the Texas National Guard to make immigration arrests. This is important because ICE relies heavily on support from local and state law enforcement for deportation operations. And that's why a lot of these, in these blue states, you've seen the sanctuary city and sanctuary state movement to block access to state resources and stop, local law enforcement and state law enforcement agencies from helping out ICE. But I think, this move is going to bolster ICE immigration enforcement efforts, but Something else I've seen is that there are some of these sanctuary cities, even in red states. And there's 3 of them that I know of for sure: Austin, Texas, Atlanta, Georgia, and Tampa, Florida. And I think as some of these immigration enforcement efforts expand, we could even see some anti-ICE protests in some of these cities, because over the weekend, there were some major anti-ICE protests, I believe in Seattle, Washington, and Los Angeles, California, that did seem to get pretty rowdy, including some fires, I think, were started on vehicles, and there was protesters going into traffic. And I think we could see something like that possibly happen in a few cases in red states too.
All right, thanks, Robert. All right, let's move on to our next item. Mike, it looks like we for a while now, there have been several corporations, major corporations, that have been leaving Delaware. This is a central hub for incorporating as businesses. There's certain kinds of, it's very business friendly. There's a lot of benefits for doing so. But recently we saw that Elon Musk was he was criticizing Delaware and the way in which these companies, many of the different regulations that these companies are forced to jump through, and some of the pressure that's applied. So it sounds like, though, that we're kind of seeing an exodus of some of these companies from Delaware. What's going on? What's the latest?
Yeah, Delaware has really been kind of the gold standard for incorporating a business. And that has obviously been changing. Major U.S. corporations are leaving Delaware, at least considering leaving Delaware, for more business-friendly states like Nevada and Texas. I'm going to talk about the Texas Triangle here in a minute. So Dropbox, a tech company, online like data storage company, recently signaled that they intend to reincorporate in Nevada. Meta, which is the Facebook parent company of Facebook and Instagram, are considering doing the same. As you mentioned, last year, Tesla changed their incorporation out of Delaware to Texas after a judge essentially forced Elon Musk to purchase Twitter, or at least to continue on with the bid. And then also twice overruled this multi-billion-dollar pay package, which was approved by Tesla shareholders. She essentially said it was illegal, much to the puzzlement of a lot of people. Also, billionaire asset manager Bill Ackman said that he was also he will move his Pershing Square hedge fund management company out of Delaware. He's also looking at Nevada and Texas. And this is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's just ongoing uncertainty over the judicial system in Delaware, which many have said is engaging in judicial tyranny, or at least some sort of judicial activism. There's a Delaware Chancery Court. Not only have they made surprise rulings against established case law, and again, if you're business, you really dislike uncertainty, but the Delaware Supreme Court last year was reportedly considering barring a corporation's attempts to reincorporate in another state. How a state Supreme Court can do that, I'm not sure, but they're trying. They've also been trying to force fees on companies moving out of Delaware to other states. A lot like California has imposed the moving tax, or whatever they call it, for very wealthy people leaving California. The second reason is because this really has to do with how the country's economic hubs are shifting. And we're seeing a lot of corporations and a lot of money moving to Texas, specifically in this Texas Triangle. So last year, Texas started a new Texas Business Court, where they're now hearing only business cases. The Texas Stock Exchange up in Dallas is expected to open in 2026. And so really, this is part of a broader economic and business realignment in the country. By the end of this decade, the Texas Triangle here on this map, this is this mega region between Dallas, Houston, and Austin, San Antonio, it's expected to reach a population of 21 million. That's about the same size as a New York City metro area. So I'm just seeing a lot of signs shaping up that say the greater Dallas-Fort Worth area in the Texas Triangle is is really going to become possibly a financial hub that rivals really what we consider the traditional financial hub in the Northeast: New York City, greater Connecticut, et cetera.
Thank you, Mike. All right, let's move on now to our next item. Jared, we're going to pull you up for this one. We got a big announcement yesterday. There's been a lot of wrangling between Panama's government and Panama's president with the Trump administration over the Panama Canal. Sounds like we got an update, though, from the Secretary of State and the president of Panama. What's going on?
Absolutely. So over the weekend, Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with Panamanian officials who agreed to all of the following. Panama will not renew the 2017 Silk Road Memorandum of Understanding with China, which is huge because that's effectively stepping out of the Belt and Road Initiative. America may use an airstrip in southern Panama for its last leg of deportations to Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, and other South American countries. For those who don't know, Panama, right at the tip of there's a region called the Darien Gap with Colombia that's enormous for border crossings right now. Basically, a lot of them start in Colombia, cross there, and then go north. This will help establish a presence there and get a lot of gangs like Tren de Aragua back to Venezuela. The Panama Canal Authority also said that they will work with the U.S. Navy to prioritize its ships in crossing. And what that is, that's actually a security guarantee for the United States, making sure that, the Panamanian government is saying, we will not impede your ability to actually conduct missions for your national security. That's kind of a slap in the face for any potential Chinese presence that we've been talking about, because the big question there has been, will China force them to shut down the Panama Canal and prevent trade or troop movement? And here's Panama saying, no, we're going to work with the U.S. to make sure that that does not happen. Now, additionally, sorry, I moved it. Additionally, I think the working directly with the U.S. Navy indicates that the Trump team may actually negotiate a rotating Navy presence near the canal. And what that would allow the United States to do is more fully determine China's role in the area. There are plenty of assets the Navy can put there just to determine what is in the region. It will present forces, so effectively we would guard the Panama Canal as long as you have a presence there, that you have presence and you can maintain the canal. And I think most influentially, it would allow us to exercise military diplomacy. Whenever a U.S. Navy strike group or surface action group pulls into a port, they flush that area with money. It is pretty well known that basically what that is kind of roundabout way of a foreign direct investment right into your port city, which is huge for foreign nations.
Yeah, just to add a little bit of color to this, as we understand, Donald Trump on the campaign trail said many times that he would not rule out the use of military force, that he would consider all options in ensuring that the Panama Canal stays friendly and open to the United States and to minimize foreign influence over there, namely China. From what I understand, when Marco Rubio made his visit there, he was very enthusiastically supportive of what Trump had already stated, and so he essentially just restated those positions, and it sounds like it's made quite an effect. As I understand it, also he emphasized the fact that Panama is still viewed as a major strategic point for the United States, and that would continue to do so under this administration. And so I think that this is something that we're seeing in the culture of the State Department, a lot more strident discussion of national interest and the United States' interests in these areas and over the Western Hemisphere. So I do think that that is significant. All right, moving on, our last item for the day, Jared. So it looks like China, there's a lot of discussion, especially with some of these tariffs with Mexico and Canada dealing with the fentanyl crisis. Looks like China has a response to that. What's going on?
Yes. So China's Ministry of Commerce, otherwise known as the MOFCOM, they officially filed a lawsuit with the World Trade Organization in response to America's tariffs. And in this same announcement, the Ministry of Commerce for China also called for America to, quote, objectively and rationally view and handle its own fentanyl and other issues rather than resorting to tariff threats against other countries. This was not a one-off. China's foreign ministry released a similar statement claiming, quote, fentanyl is a problem of the U.S. and China has the strictest and most thoroughly enforced narcotics control policies in the world. This map that's up here is actually from the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, showing that final fentanyl and fentanyl precursors are flowing basically to and from China and India right into the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Now, China is framing this as an inappropriate way to address America's fentanyl problem. But China's also doing very little to persuade President Trump that they're not responsible for the fentanyl precursors. And in fact, saying, okay, well, you handle your own drug problem, I think is going to be highly incendiary, because Trump is taking the fentanyl crisis quite seriously. And I think China's actions are going to result in a worsening trade relationship.
Yeah, and to add a little bit of perspective here, the WTO, China often, the US and China and other nations as well, but they often adjudicate some of these issues at the WTO because they can do, it's essentially like forum or venue shopping. Is the WTO is often a friendly venue for these nations to not only address direct trade concerns as it's intended, but also to kind of pursue other political angles as well and get a fair hearing in front of the world, and then be able to apply a little additional pressure. So it's not necessarily like this pristine operation. China and the United States will fight over some of these issues that revolve around trade, but have a very like political or geopolitical dimension. And so it's not the first time China has done this, but it is interesting that they've gone to the WTO. But it is kind of one of the first times that we've really seen China address this fentanyl crisis in this way. And I agree with your analysis, Jared, that I think that this will be viewed as incendiary for the Trump administration. All right, Jared, thank you so much for your warning items. We have a little bit of time, not much, so let's hit a couple questions. Robert, I've got a question that I think is best suited for you. Frozen Nomad asks, are there specific benchmarks by the Trump administration for addressing fentanyl and border issues that would be required to drop these tariffs from Canada and Mexico? What do you say?
And in the EO, no, there are not any, X amount of fentanyl caught at the border, et cetera, but it does direct basically the Department of Homeland Security to inform the president if they're, of Canada's enforcement efforts, and says that if the president determines that the enforcement efforts are sufficient, then the order is revoked. Basically, the tariffs are revoked. So yeah, it's all centered on this fentanyl issue, and I think the Trump administration, or President Trump, is kind of leaving room for some discretion here in either direction of keeping or letting the tariffs go without implementing any kind of specific, benchmarks, numeric, like quantitative benchmarks or anything like that. And then there was another thing as part of this EO that I thought was important, is that there's actually it ends what's called a duty drawback, and I think that's going to be one of the things that really hits, like the automotive industry, for instance, because so. In the system before this EO takes effect, if a U.S. manufacturer, like a vehicle manufacturer, buys parts from overseas, assembles them, and then exports that finished product, they can get some of that tariff back from the components. But in this case, they can't now, according to EO. So I think it's another area where you're going to see impacts on the handful of products that are manufactured in the U.S., like vehicles that are made from foreign source components that are then sometimes exported to foreign countries.
All right. Thanks for that perspective, Robert. All right. Well, that does it for today's report, for our briefing today. You can catch today's report in your inbox later on today. We will also be back tomorrow at 08 Central Time for the next morning briefing. But we just want to thank you for all the excellent questions. Thank you for all your support and for subscribing. And as always, stay out front.